July 9 edition of PFTPM. It's already the ninth day of July. We are not very far away from training camps opening, rookies reporting or not reporting, veterans holding out or not holding out. Before you know it, it all starts. That's the thing. It really is the proverbial, if not literal, calm before the storm. We get through, and I've been doing this a long time now. You get through all of the frenetic activity once the draft comes and goes, and it just begins to taper off with the offseason workouts and the OTAs and the mandatory mini camps. The next thing you know, they're all done. And then you start wondering, is it ever going to come back again? Is there ever going to be anything to talk about? Is there going to be anything to cover? Well, this year, there was plenty to cover in the slow time, thanks to the Sunday ticket trial, which I probably will get some questions about later. But soon there'll be a lot more to cover because football will indeed be back. And as they say, better than ever. One guy who won't be back, at least not when the regular season starts, he'll be gone for 8 games. That's Cameron Sutton, the Steelers cornerback, who was signed by Pittsburgh, where he had started his career for some 6 seasons before joining the Lions. Lions abruptly dumped him when they found out he was wanted on felony charges in Florida. He eventually had those charges converted to misdemeanors, eventually entered a diversion program. And I was on with my friends at 93.7 The Fan in Pittsburgh several weeks ago, right after the Steelers signed Cameron Sutton. And I said that based upon the affidavit that was reported in the Tampa Bay Times and the fact that there was a diversion program entered into, which is a roundabout way of acknowledging responsibility for the allegations, when you look at the nature of the allegations, and when you look at the aggravating factors that can take a 6-game baseline suspension for domestic violence and bump it north, the types of allegations involved, the possibility that it might have happened in the presence of their children, you get extra games. And for Sutton, it was 2 extra games. So it's 8 games he'll miss. And it's about $577,000 in lost wages under his contract with the Steelers. But remember, the Lions were due to pay him $10.5 million this year, fully guaranteed. They voided the guarantees and dumped him when they found out that he was wanted in Florida on what at the time were felony charges. And it was 3 weeks or longer before he finally turned himself in. I think the Steelers deserve to be scrutinized and criticized for making the decision to give Sutton safe harbor. When you look at the affidavit, the allegations are strong. And I always compare these cases to Ray Rice. And I ask this question. If we had video of what this guy did, would he ever play in the NFL again? I mean, Ray Rice was going to continue playing until we saw with our own eyes what we should have been able to conjure with our mind's eye. That's what was so weird about the whole Ray Rice thing from almost 10 years ago. The video that emerged on the Monday after the regular season started confirmed what we knew or should have known about what happened in that elevator. But it's one thing to hear what happened. It's another thing to see what happened. And in this case, what happened was 8 games for Cameron Sutton. So far, the Steelers haven't gotten the kind of scrutiny that maybe they should. And of course, there are plenty of Steelers fans that get mad if you even point it out. Of course, they want to bash the Browns for signing Deshaun Watson. I mean, at the end of the day, Sutton was only suspended 3 games fewer than Watson was suspended. And you could argue that maybe Sutton should have been suspended more than that. And again, if we had the video of what happened, Sutton probably would never be playing in the NFL again. And who knows? Maybe by the time the Steelers get halfway through the 2024 season and Sutton is eligible to be restored to the active roster, they'll decide we're just going to move on. The guys we have are doing the job well enough. We don't need to bring him back. That's the thing to remember about these suspensions. If it's a fringe player, there's no requirement that he be put back on the team. His salary won't be guaranteed because he won't be on the roster week 1. So who knows? Maybe he'll never actually play for the Steelers again. We're used to hearing about NFL teams and owners in the league itself as the defendant in a lawsuit. This was surprising to me yesterday to see that lurking kind of at the bottom of this controversy that's been engulfing Jerry Jones for the past few years, although it hasn't really been as big of a deal as maybe it should have been. Jerry Jones accused of being the father of a woman who was born back in the 90s. There was a paternity suit filed a couple of years ago. In February this year, he was ordered to actually submit to a DNA test. She later sued Jerry Jones and others for defamation. That claim was dismissed. But when that lawsuit was filed, Jerry Jones actually raised a counterclaim accusing Alexandra Davis, his alleged daughter, and the alleged mother, well, the actual mother of Alexandra Davis. There's nothing to prove there. That's, the birth process would tend to be conclusive proof of the fact that Cynthia Davis is the mother of Alexandra Davis, but the question of whether or not Jerry Jones is the father has never been conclusively determined. But what happened was back in the 90s, they worked out a deal. They worked out a settlement. Jones would pay the money necessary for the care, feeding, and the raising of Alexandra Davis, and they would never say a word about it. They wouldn't sue. They wouldn't say anything. Nothing would happen, and that was that. Well, what Jerry did, and apparently he didn't do it after the first lawsuit, but decided after the second one, okay, fine. You know what? You want to get nuts? Let's get nuts. I keep using that Batman reference, but it's been fitting more than once in recent weeks. He filed a counterclaim arguing breach of contract, and apparently wants to get all that money back. So it's not quite that simple. A lot of times a contract will have in it what's called a liquidated damages clause that says, for example, if you ever breach this, you have to pay back all the money. That's not really damages, that's a penalty. And that will be one of the big arguments if and when this thing moves forward. It's supposed to go to trial in a couple of weeks. That's what surprised me. We didn't even know this thing's going to trial. They're going to pick a jury on the 19th of July, and they're going to start trial on that Monday, the 22nd, with Jerry Jones as the plaintiff. And, this isn't like a defamation case where his whole life becomes fair game and his cross-examination could delve into a bunch of different things. This is a very simple business proposition. Hell, he may not even have to testify. You need somebody to get the contract into evidence. Maybe the lawyer who negotiated it will do it. It's a contract. It's a document. Now, the plaintiffs who became defendants because they filed the lawsuit, that claim was thrown out, and now this counterclaim is all that's left. The defendants, they deny wrongdoing. And one issue that I flagged yesterday as I was looking at this, for people under the age of 18, you can't be bound by a contract unless they went through whatever process would apply in Texas. In most states, what happens is, and this usually comes up, this is your free continuing legal education seminar for today. If there is an injury case and a child is injured in a car accident, which is horrible when it happens, it's horrible anytime anyone's injured in an accident, but quite often a child is injured. In order to actually have a binding release of claims, if they settle the case for whatever the payment will be, you have to have the court appoint what's called a guardian ad litem. It's a lawyer who looks over everything, makes sure it's all being handled fairly, who acts as the advocate for the child, so that when the time comes to end the case, to settle the case, it's a binding contract on the child. Because ordinarily, if you're under the age of 18, you're not bound by any contracts. So unless they went through that process and there was a guardian that was appointed for Alexandra Davis, none of this is binding on her. Whatever money changed hands, whatever promises were made, they do not bind her at all unless they have that formal court process. And maybe they had it for all anyone knows, but that's something to keep an eye on. The whole thing really is surprising, though. An owner going on the offensive. And, there was a quote from one of Jerry Jones' lawyers saying this is about the principle, but there's also a lot of money involved. Well, he doesn't need the money. At a certain point, you come off as a bully when you're a multi-billionaire and you're trying to squeeze money out of people that you've already given the money to for taking care of what might be your daughter. And we still haven't, I don't know. I mean, maybe really rich people just don't have to listen to court orders. It was February when he was ordered to submit to the DNA test. I assume it's tied up on appeals or something along those lines. But at some point, you just got to do it. At some point, if you don't do it, you're in contempt of court and everything that goes along with that. All right, next topic. This is something we caught wind of yesterday and we worked on it today. And this one surprised me, not on the surface, but when I began to learn more about what's going on here. Richard Seymour, who was involved in the hiring process that resulted in the Raiders making Antonio Pierce the full-time head coach and Tom Telesco the new GM. Richard Seymour sat in on interviews. And now we know why. Richard Seymour is in the process of buying a piece of the Raiders. And that actually predates Tom Brady's attempt to buy a piece of the Raiders. It's been going on for about 4 years. And this is a product of what Al Davis had done for much of his time as owner of the Raiders, ahead of his time, visionary, inclusive, diverse. Tom Flores is the head coach. Art Shell is the head coach. Amy Trask is the CEO of the Oakland, Los Angeles, Las Vegas Raiders, although she was gone by the time they moved to Las Vegas. This is Mark Davis with a commitment to equality and diversity, reaching out to Richard Seymour several years ago and getting him in the fold. My understanding is that Seymour and Tom Brady, because Tom Brady had that deal, and it was for about 10% of the team, had that deal that was discounted dramatically by Mark Davis. I think at one point Davis was going to hire Tom Brady and pay him equity in lieu of salary or in addition to salary. Once that went away a year ago, they had to take a closer look at the numbers. It was Jim Irsay, the Colts owner, who said during the October league meetings that there's too much of a discount that Davis is giving Brady. They've since been working on it. My understanding is the thing that is going to push this across the pun intended goal line, I couldn't think of a better metaphor, is Seymour and Brady coming together. Seymour and Brady, as I understand it, are going to own 10.4% of the team. Seymour's got partners working with him. Brady's got partners working with him. They're going to own that 10.4% together. Now, Brady was initially going to have 10 by himself. So to rectify this issue with Davis trying to give Brady a sweetheart deal, Brady's going to own a lot less on his own than he was supposed to. It's Brady and Seymour together for 10.4%. My understanding is it's very close to being finalized. Then the league would take it up in October at the next ownership meetings, 24 votes necessary to gain approval. And the addition of Seymour, and I think the fact that at the end of the day, it's going to be fair market value for that 10.4% of the Raiders, that's going to be enough to get it done. There's also that lingering question about Tom Brady's job with Fox. Remember back in May, the commissioner said something about they've come up with guidelines or parameters or whatever for Brady's work with Fox, given that he'll have a clear conflict of interest when he's at Chiefs practice this year. Chiefs 49ers play on Fox. You go to Chiefs practice, go to Chiefs meetings. You're going to be an owner of the Raiders at that point. They've got guidelines in place. They wouldn't tell me what the guidelines were after the commissioner mentioned guidelines, which is odd because I don't know what he would have said if somebody would have followed up and said, what are the guidelines? Well, we're not telling you. And I don't know. At some point, we got to know what the guidelines are. Because at some point, we got to be able to look at the guidelines and say they are or aren't good enough. It's not good enough to just say, trust us, there's guidelines. What are the guidelines? How far do they go? And look, I stand by my previously articulated position that it's not too much to expect Tom Brady to pick a lane here. Either be an owner of the Raiders or a broadcaster of all NFL games on Fox, but not both. Because they do have an inherent conflict. I'm not against somebody being ambitious and entrepreneurial and trying to make the absolute most out of their life and buy as many things and be involved in as many things as they want. But this is a situation where the two things, to me, don't mesh. You've got a clear duty of loyalty, a fiduciary duty to the Raiders, and that duty is going to be undermined. Anytime you become aware of something, it's going to be tested. It's going to be violated. You got a duty to Fox to not misappropriate the information that you get at these meetings. Your duty to the Raiders would suggest anything you find out that can help the Raiders, you better tell the Raiders. So it's just a position he shouldn't want to be in. It's kind of like when we talk about the commissioner being the person in charge of handling arbitrations involving the teams that have hired him and that pay him. You shouldn't want to be in that situation because it's clearly a conflict of interest. Anyway, the good news for Tom Brady is the involvement of Richard Seymour apparently is going to get this thing to the point where it's been unable to get since we first became aware of Tom Brady potentially buying a piece of the Raiders in February, I believe, of 2023. It feels like it's been around a lot longer than that, but I think it's only a year and a half that we've been dealing with these issues. All right, one more topic. And I've had this Because what I do is I keep a list of topics I want to get to here and then maybe post at PFT. This is something I've been thinking about for a while. And Joe Burrow's comments to my friends Big Cat and my internet son PFT commenter about flag football made me realize now's the time to address this. And Burrow said to them that he wants to play flag football in 2028 when flag football is part of the Olympics. And we've heard other NFL players say, I'd like to be involved in this. Right. You want to get a gold medal if you can. And because they don't have tackle football in the Olympics, and they never will, there was a time when they were kind of testing out the possibility of tackle football growing to the point where it could be an Olympic sport. And frankly, I think it would be a great winter Olympic sport, better than summer if it's tackle football. The problem is you got to have enough countries doing it, and it's got to be men's and women's. It's so much easier to do flag football. More countries can get involved. Men's and women's flag football teams will be assembled. And the NFL, coincidental to this effort that was ultimately successful to make flag football part of the Olympics, the NFL is all in with flag football. It's flag football this and it's flag football that. And there's a caveat. The old school football people look at flag football and look at the NFL's effort to encourage and advance flag football as a potential threat. And I'm not saying they're right. I'm just saying they're concerned. It's a potential threat to the supply of tackle football players. Because if we start diverting kids from tackle football to flag football, which really it's two different sports, different skills, different abilities, different mental and physical tests when you don't have the kind of contact that you have in tackle football. But by pushing them toward flag football, it pushes them away from tackle, and it potentially undermines the supply of, in the future, players who are the best of the best. When the commissioner was testifying a couple of years ago this month in the lawsuit over whether or not the NFL is going to get insurance coverage for the concussion settlement, he was pressed on this issue of the potential existential threat to football from kids not being allowed to play youth football. And he said, oh, well, we don't really care about that because there's such a small percentage that finally make it to the NFL. But the thing is, if you start taking kids that could eventually make it to the NFL and having them play other sports and never developing as football players with helmets and shoulder pads and everything that goes with playing tackle football, you are hurting the supply. You are. Included within the large percentage of folks who would have never played in the NFL anyway, who are not playing tackle football, are the diamonds in the haystack, as Chris Sims would say. So this is similar but different. And yes, you could say, oh, hey, at least they're playing football, and maybe some of these skills like passing and catching, because it's basically 7-on-7, that's transferable. It is to an extent, but it's still, if it becomes bigger and bigger, if flag football becomes a thing, and look, I don't know. Do you want to watch flag football? Ask yourself that question about any Olympic event. In a vacuum, you take away the national pride and the gold, silver, and bronze medals. Do you really care about flag football? Maybe you do. Maybe they'll be successful. Maybe they'll force it on us enough that we'll eventually say, okay, fine. I like it. It's like that meal you have to eat over and over and over again. After a while, you realize, I kind of like it now. I've acquired a taste for flag football. Most of us prefer to watch tackle football 11-on-11. Flag football, and I've seen it, it's been on TV before. It's like, maybe it's fun for them. It really isn't fun for us to watch. They're banking on that changing. But the core concern for some of those old school football people is, why are we taking potential tackle football players and dangling some other version of the sport, which really isn't the same sport, in their faces, and maybe luring them away from playing tackle football? Something to keep an eye on. All right. Let's answer some of your questions. First, I got to find the tweet. Here it is. Not a whole lot of questions today, which is good, because I really don't. Yesterday was like over an hour, almost an hour. I really don't want to put you through that, or myself. on a regular basis. PFT PM Posse, unless Jim Trotter settles with the NFL, won't they likely take the case all the way to the Supreme Court, where ultimately the Super Bowl rings and other gifts given to SCOTUS judges will sway them to side with the NFL? I don't know what the end game will be for the Jim Trotter case. Ultimately, you're going to have pretty solid grounds for appeal. And it comes down to how this case develops. If at the end of the day, there's enough evidence there to put this in front of a jury and the jury finds in favor of Jim Trotter, I mean, they may fight it all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, but I think at some point you just got to write the check and move on. Because whatever Jim Trotter wins, he's not going to win $14 billion. I mean, it's not going to be something that is so dramatic the NFL is going to have to go searching the couch cushions for loose change to try to pay this verdict. Whatever happens with Jim Trotter, they may just decide to be done with it, to write the check and move on. So it's premature. And it's especially premature because we won't know what legal issues could make their way up to the Supreme Court until we get through Jim Trotter's trial. Here's another one from PFT PM Posse. How do you envision a potential Bill Belichick coach team on Hard Knocks? How difficult would he make it? Does the NFL avoid putting his team on it to avoid the problems he would cause? Well, first of all, he's got to get back in the NFL. And we don't know whether or not that's going to happen. There's a formula that applies to Hard Knocks. It's been modified now that they've got preseason Hard Knocks, in-season Hard Knocks, which features all 4 teams from the same division, and now the off-season Hard Knocks. But Belichick never wanted to do it. And I had mentioned last week, as it relates to the concerns about the Giants, or maybe that was just yesterday. I don't know what day is what anymore. Anyway, Belichick was always concerned about the footage on the cutting room floor and plenty of other things. And the arguments that have been made in the past. And years ago, Steve Sabol told me that when Vince Lombardi was coaching, if there were NFL Films cameras at the practice, he would tell them to point them at the field, even if they didn't have film in them, because he was a believer. Guys would go out there and try harder if they thought they were being recorded. I just think that there's a lot more that goes into it than that. It is a distraction. Yes, you've got final say over what makes it to air, but you got to exercise that final say accurately, or you end up making things worse. So at some point, Bill Belichick might be forced to submit to Hard Knocks. And I kind of like that. Last year, it felt like maybe the Jets were going to rebel because they didn't want to do Hard Knocks and they were told they're going to do it and they just eventually accepted it. I want a whole team that acts like James Harrison did when he was on the Bengals and they were the Hard Knocks team. And he's giving the camera the finger every time he saw it. I want an organizational middle finger being given to Hard Knocks. Now, that would be reality. It's not reality when everyone goes along with it. No, the cameras and microphones are here. I want reality of these cameras are here and you don't want them here. Too bad. Go about your business. That's far closer to reality than anything that we see in reality TV. What else is next? Brass Monkey 2383. When should I start to worry about Caleb Williams and Rome Odunze remaining unsigned with the Bears? I think it's fair to start worrying now because, again, we're a week away from the Bears rookies reporting. And yes, the NFL is a deadline-driven business, but what are you arguing about now? There's nothing to negotiate other than, say it with me now, 1, signing bonus cash flow, 2, void language for guaranteed money, 3, whether or not there's going to be offset language attached to any remaining guarantees. That's it. Unless there's something else that I don't know about, which isn't impossible, which is probably likely. And maybe it comes down to Williams and Odunze wanting their signing bonus paid in full sooner rather than later. Maybe it's that simple. We talked about that yesterday, time value of money, interest value. If I got $30 million coming to me and it's 15 now and 15 next year, I'd rather have all 30 right now. That may be what's holding it up. Either way, we're getting closer and closer to the start of camp, to when they report, and maybe they're just in a stare down, waiting for someone to blink, and maybe someone will blink right about the time that it's time to show up for camp. Burn unit, if the NFL is forced to pay out for the class action, would they be able to pay out in payments or would it have to be a lump sum? I mean, look, when the money's due, the money's due. And then it becomes an issue of how you collect on an outstanding verdict. And that's a separate negotiation. And, you know, the lawyers, how aggressive are they going to be? Are they going to try to seize assets? Are they going to try to garnish wages? So it's a good problem to have. And usually, big companies that get hit for a significant verdict, when it's time to finally pay, they just pay. They don't want to have to worry about being chased around because they have the money. It's easier to just pay the money. I think that what the NFL should be doing is coming up with a clear plan to have that money ready to go once all appeals have been exhausted. There's still, and I'll tell you what I'm doing right now. Beyond working my way through a 2,506-page trial transcript, and I am very pissed at myself for writing that check. I want to go back and kick past me's ass for writing this check because current and future me has to read that entire mother effing transcript, 2,506 pages. Anyway, one of the other things I'm currently doing, I've gotten my hands on the latest submission by the league to the court seeking that the verdict either be thrown out and judgment entered for the NFL or the amount of the verdict being knocked down all the way to $1. And there's some persuasive arguments in it. And I was just the NFL's side. And I suspect that the plaintiffs will tell a very different story. But based upon what I'm reading, there's a chance that the jury, instead of accepting the calculations that were given to them by the witnesses put on behalf of the class to prove what the damages were as a result of the NFL gouging customers for the Sunday ticket package, the jury just came up with their own calculation that has no basis in evidence. And you just can't do that. You can't just say, okay, the NFL's in the wrong. Now, what are we going to pay the plaintiffs? Well, the plaintiffs put on some evidence about what they're, but it's kind of confusing. I don't really agree with that. Hey, let's do this. Let's come up with our own. If that's the case, it's going to, I think about the things that when I was practicing law and putting on a damages case, because in a civil case, when you represent the plaintiff, you got to prove liability and damages. It's not enough to just prove liability, as the USFL found out 38 years ago. You still have to have damages too. They proved that the NFL engaged in anti-competitive practices, built a monopoly, and used it against the USFL. And they failed to prove damages. The NFL at one point asks for it to be reduced to that same $1. Without mentioning the USFL case, they mentioned they'd like it to be reduced to $1. So, I don't know, could there be a new trial on damages? Could the case just be reduced to $1? Could the judge say, hey, you haven't proved your damages case? And apparently, and it's going to take me a while to get to this point in the transcript, but when the judge was berating the plaintiff's lawyers in open court with the jury not present about the weakness of the case, and I might just direct a verdict, I'm getting the impression that the core of that was basically your damages case is ass. And if I change my mind on whether or not these two expert witnesses, or however many they were, but there were two different formulas for damages that were presented. If I decide that these folks shouldn't be regarded as experts and I'm going to throw out their opinions, you got nothing. You got no way to prove damages. It's not like, when you have an injury, to use that example again, you've got hospital bills, doctor visits, follow-ups. It's very easy to put together lost wages if you miss work. It's very easy to put together what you've lost. In this case, it's not easy to put together what the plaintiffs lost because you have to prove, okay, here's what we paid. What would we have paid if the NFL wasn't engaging in antitrust violations? What would the price have been? And if the case made by the plaintiffs fails to hold water, the jury just can't go. And the allegation contained in the paperwork filed by the NFL last week is that they just got their iPhone calculator and they came up with their own formula. And the NFL's lawyers recreated it like to the penny of what they believe the jury did to come up with their own measure of damages. So keep an eye on that. I'll be writing about that at PFT as I continue to read through. I'm on page 151. That just tells you how far I have to go. Now, I just got it last night. 151 out of 2,506 pages. Yeah. Past me deserves, for many reasons, a serious ass kicking at this point. Next question. Logan Bear, if a new NFL franchise is added outside of the U.S. or not, what's the process of constructing a roster? NHL has the expansion draft. Is the NFL something similar? I think they would come up with their own rules each time, and I think that's how it works. Every time the NFL adds an expansion team, they come up with rules for building out that roster. It becomes more challenging if you do put a team in London. We've talked about that in the past, all of the various issues and wrinkles that would make it challenging to start a team from scratch, or any team, relocate a team. If the Jaguars, for whatever reason, has their deal fall through in Jacksonville and Shad Khan decides to move the team, there would be issues there when it comes to the possibility of the guy who gets drafted says, nope, I'll just not play football this year. Thank you very much. I don't want to move to England. So they would come up with their own set of rules, case by case, if and when there is expansion. Tom Marshall, as an overseas NFL fan via its partner, DAZN, I get to stream any game, any week for just under $50 a year, $60 a year. Are U.S. fans just a victim of geography? I think it's not just geography. I think it's the NFL knows that American football fans will pay the price, that a certain percentage will do what they have to do to watch the games they want to watch, even if it means paying way too much for the full package, despite the fact that they only want to watch the games of one team. One of the things I noticed in the opening statement offered up by Amanda Bond, one of the lawyers representing the plaintiffs, apparently in Canada, it is a lot cheaper and there is a lot more flexibility because the regulatory environment in Canada requires it to be. So, the NFL in the U.S. tried to get away with what it could get away with. And it got away with it for 30 years. And it still might get away with it. Some of the stuff that I've gleaned from the opening statement, and I'm a firm believer based upon reading the plaintiff's opening statement that they got the jury convinced. Just that opening statement that the NFL was in the wrong. There's some stuff in there, and I'll write about it at PFT. I don't want to misremember accidentally some of the stuff that I saw, but there's some documents making it, to me, pretty clear that the NFL knew what they were doing. They were careful about what they said. And there was a lot of unspoken. There's a great example that Amanda Bond used in her opening statement about the implicit agreement that was made between Thelma and Louise to drive the car off the cliff. They never came out and said to each other, let's just drive the car off the cliff. Sometimes agreements are reached with knowing glances, a thumbs up, a shaking of hands, or just going about your business. And I think that's part of what resulted in the verdict in this case. The jury believed that even though the NFL's witnesses all said we had no secret agreements, we had no side deals, we had no effort to tell DirecTV what they needed to charge for Sunday Ticket, I think that there was enough there that the jury could say, yeah, we see right through that. We know what you were doing. So again, more on that to come at PFT. Scotty Ferg, what do you think of Joe Burrow's Pro Bowl second bye week idea if there's 18 games? I never understood the structure of bye weeks. Why don't they have half the teams take their bye week 8 and the other half week 9? Look, and I think Joe Burrow has suggested something like have the Pro Bowl in the middle of the season, or they're never going to shut the season down once they start. They're not going to give everybody a week off. What they're going to do at most is have a second bye week that gets sprinkled around each of the various weeks of the season, just like the first bye week. They did it in 1993. There were 2 bye weeks. At the time, there were 28 teams. There are now 32 teams. At the time they did 2 bye weeks, the networks didn't like the idea that stretching the season out, having more teams off, because every team's off twice now instead of once, it dilutes the quality of the individual weeks. Coincidentally, 93 was the last year before they launched Sunday Ticket. I don't know, maybe that's not a coincidence. But now, if you do a second bye week and an 18th game, how much does it dilute the slate of games each week? That's going to be one of the questions the NFL has to ask, because I think it is very difficult to make the case of 18 games without a second bye, especially because, and I had somebody argue, even with 17 games, all of these standalone games and all the things they're doing to have a team play this day, that day, this day, that day. The Chiefs play every day of the week except Tuesday this year. We're probably already at the point where you need to have a second bye week to ensure that there's rest. Once the NFL believed its own talking point about short week football, that the injury rate for games played on Thursday after playing on Sunday is no different than the injury rate for games played on Sunday after playing on Sunday. Once they sold themselves on that, hey, we'll have teams play on Sunday to Thursday or Wednesday to Saturday or 4-day turnaround as much as we want, because it's not an injury issue. It's not a health and safety issue. And I think anybody who gets it, anybody who does it, knows what it feels like to get out of bed the day after a game and what it feels like to get yourself ready to play 3 days after that moment where you've rolled out of bed the day after a game versus 6 days after you've rolled out of bed after playing an NFL game. And again, Jets, 3 games in 10 days to start the season. Aaron Rodgers, 4 snaps of regular season football since January of 2023. 3 games in 10 days to start the season. Dave wants to know what's going on with the Jon Gruden lawsuit. Look, we addressed this last week. I'll give you the quick summary, Dave. Jon Gruden's screwed at this point because his only hope, he lost an effort to get a rehearing before the full Nevada Supreme Court on the question of whether or not he has to arbitrate his case. His final effort, if he's going to even give it a try, is to get the U.S. Supreme Court to take up the case. They probably won't. If they do, there's a pretty good chance by a vote of 6-3, they'll say you have to go to arbitration. At some point, he's got to go to arbitration. And we all lose in that regard because nobody ever finds out who undermined the integrity of the 2021 NFL season by taking out Jon Gruden, by strategically leaking supposedly secret emails to the Wall Street Journal and then the New York Times to take out Jon Gruden during the season. They could have done it before the season. They could have done it after the season. They did it during the season. Regardless of whether or not Jon Gruden deserved to be fired, nobody deserved to have that happen during the season. The Raiders didn't deserve it. The teams they were competing with didn't deserve it. And anybody out there that, may have had a futures bet on the Raiders winning the Super Bowl that year, well, if I'd have known somebody was going to take out Jon Gruden 5 weeks in, I probably wouldn't have made that bet. So that's my biggest problem with it. We're never going to know who did it. And separate and apart from what you think about Jon Gruden, the fact that he was taken out during the season by someone is something that a lot more people should care about than apparently do. All right, let's wrap this up soon. Let's see what else we have here. There's some more Sunday Ticket questions. I've said a lot about Sunday Ticket, and I'll be writing more about it. So if you have more questions about it, feel free to ask them. Too Cold Hands. Do you think it's a make or break year for Joe Douglas? I keep hearing about hot seat, but the roster is incredible. If anything, I think it's just Saleh on the hot seat. Aaron Rodgers put it best when he was on Pat McAfee's show at one point this offseason. If they don't get to the playoffs this year, everybody's gone. Everybody's gone. Douglas, Saleh, Rodgers, everybody, except ownership. Can't fire ownership. So I think everybody's on the hot seat. It's got to work this year, or there's going to be major changes with the New York Jets, including Aaron Rodgers not being back in 2025. Last question, also from Too Cold Hands. How was your vacation? I'm living my vacation. I don't need a vacation. Somebody said, you need better perspective. You need to take time off. You need to get away from this. What if this is what I enjoy? What if I like this? What if I want to do this? What if I get pleasure and satisfaction out of sitting here and talking about football? So we're going to the beach next week. And as I said yesterday, I will make an effort to do, technology permitting, and unless I'm really hungover, on any of the days of the week, which is possible. It's not out of the question. But I managed last week to do it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Undisclosed location somewhere on the East Coast. PFTPM will be possibly originating from there next week. And look, in an Olympic year, I know how it goes. PFT Live ends up off a little bit longer. It's all hands on deck to handle the Olympics. August 12th, Sims and I will be back. Until then, though, I'm going to do PFTPM as often as I can, and there will be constant content at ProFootballTalk.com, especially since Past Me decided that it would be a good idea to spend a lot of money on a 2,506-word transcript, and then current and future me would have to read the damn thing. Thanks for nothing, Past Florio. Go to hell, Past Florio. I'm sure plenty of people would say this thing to present Florio. I'm going to take a break until tomorrow. Hopefully we do it tomorrow. The spirit is willing tomorrow. There's a chance I might not be able to do it, but I'm hoping to do it probably mid to late afternoon. Thursday, Friday, can't do it this week. Sorry about that in advance. Blame future Florio for that. Current Florio signing off. See you tomorrow, hopefully. Hi, it's Mike Florio. Thanks for watching PFT on YouTube. Hit subscribe for the latest news and analysis from Pro Football Talk.